Hi, everyone. It's Suzanne Tucker, founder of Generation Mindful, and your host for the Reparent Yourself Summit. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Robert Jackman. Robert is a best-selling author, inner child expert, and board certified psychotherapist with the National Board of Certified Counselors. And Robert has helped countless people on their healing path, both in his private practice and through his books. So in addition to his practice and teaching master level classes, he's led outpatient groups and clinics and hospitals and is a popular guest speaker on topics like we're going to be talking about today: codependency, boundary setting, couples communication, inner child work, mindfulness, and the role of spirituality and healing. Robert is also a Reiki master who uses energy psychology in his practice and personal development. Robert, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'm very happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. We've had a rich conversation pre-interview, talking about the opportunity to be with our guests today and talking about this important topic. And what I love about your work in your practice and in your writing is how accessible you are in your sharing. So I thought it'd be lovely today if we could open with you sharing a little bit about your personal reparenting journey and how it led you to this work as a therapist and writer.
That's a great question. And I get asked that a lot, but I'm happy to share that story. So in my early 20s, I really didn't understand why I was unhappy. I seemed to have a lot of things going for me in my life, but I couldn't understand why I was carrying this sort of sense of burden about me. And I also didn't understand why my relationships were kind of wonky and why I was choosing people that weren't so good for me. And I was lucky enough to go and see a therapist who did inner child healing work. And that really opened up my eyes. I began to see the wounded patterns I established in childhood and how I was just bringing those into my adult life. And that really began my lifelong journey of healing for myself, as well as learning how to use these tools and interpret them for other people so they could have that same level of healing that I've been experiencing. So in a nutshell, that's how it all started. And I've been so fortunate to work with people like John Bradshaw and Claudia Black and Pia Melody and Ross Rosenberg, a lot of way showers in the community of codependency and inner child work. And so their messages have helped inform me on my journey and being able to put it out there for other people.
Wonderful. And I think as a participant of this summit, it might be a new concept to think about reparenting the wounded parts of ourselves. And as a person who's, been a parent for 20 years, the word trauma is becoming more and more popular, PTSD, trauma, and yet it remains somebody else's thing. Like, surely that does not define me, or maybe my childhood wasn't really that bad. Why am I hurting inside? Why am I struggling? And so I wondered if you could speak to kind of blowing up the myth that it's somebody else's. And because just to bring it to, why am I hurting? Is it normal that we're all saying, well, mine wasn't that bad, so I really don't deserve to be hurting? And could you speak to that?
I sure can, because I hear that a lot. And people will say, well, I didn't really have a bad childhood. And I certainly believe them. But basically, we all have picked up stuff from our childhood families that we've carried into our adult life. And as a clinician, people will say, oh, well, I didn't have a bad childhood, which I believe them. But then I wonder why they've had 2 failed marriages, or why they're talking about all of these troubles that they're having as far as their idea of themselves, being self-critical and that sort of thing. And so when we get into this work a little bit more, That's where we uncover these, we could call them mini traumas that happen in many households. So there wasn't any overt abuse, sexual, physical, or emotional, but there are these little slights that happen, these behaviors where the parents or caregivers will talk about the child being bad instead of the behavior being bad. And I have some other examples I wanted to give you later on that topic, but that's how it sort of starts and builds. And so you're right, there's a lot of language around trauma and inner child wounding and everything else. And basically, it's the human experience,
Yes.
right? So,
Yes. Shout it from the rooftops, y'all, because it's a big party. We all get to come to the summit. There's not a person on this planet that could not benefit from the work
right.
you're sharing, right? The introspection.
The introspection and being able to look at ourselves with a gentle gaze and hold all parts of ourselves, because all parts of ourselves are beautiful. It's not just like the parts that we're proud of and we're good. It's like our wounding contributes to the whole tapestry of our life. So it's being able to really look at ourselves wholly so we can then enter into a place of authentic wholeness.
You said we all come by our wounding honestly.
Yeah.
And I love that for the universality of it. And I wonder if some of us feel guilty that we are hurting. We love our parents. Maybe we think fondly of our childhood. Maybe we're scared that we can't do better, right? For our kiddos. Who are we to judge someone else? If we move past the idea that we either do it right or we do it wrong,
Mhm.
and we just say it's a human experience, it really just allows us to have that less judgment of our parents. Do you see that as a hurdle, though not wanting to hurt the generations before us or judge them, to block maybe the idea that there are things to be uncovered inside ourselves?
Certainly. And that's actually how I begin my book, Healing Your Lost Inner Child. I begin by talking about this book is not about blaming or shaming our parents or our caregivers, because we know that they did the best they had with the tools they had. So I don't think anyone starts out saying, gosh, how can I screw up my kids? We're all trying our best. We're using what we know. And that's what our parents and caregivers did. They're using what they were using what they knew, and they were trying their best. But what happens naturally is that what our parents learned, they then transferred to us. And that's the concept of intergenerational trauma. That's where, all of these sort of wounded behaviors get passed down from one generation to the next. But all of this can be healed. So it's like we're talking about trauma and wounding and all of that. All of it can be healed. We can gain this greater perspective on our situation with new functional tools, as I describe them. So this is the healed part of us that can show up and in our relationships and in our parenting.
And it's tool-based is what you just said. And that is such a highlighter moment. Tool-based, skill-based. And
Yep.
again, everyone out there, it's a human experience. So if you could share with us, maybe just give us some definitions or some understanding of some of how we could look at core wound. Maybe help us get a little closer to that as listeners.
Mm-hmm.
Do we all have a core wound? How do we find it if we do? How would we know?
Another great question. Some folks that I work with, they can identify very specific types of abuse they endured. So it could be physical, sexual, emotional, and they will tell me those stories very clearly. Other people will say, well, I had a pretty good childhood. Nothing really happened, like we were saying before. And then I'll say, okay, so where did this idea come from where you feel less than, where you feel not good enough, where you have to overcompensate? And so that's sort of the bigger, deeper dive that we're doing. And as I start out in my book, I give examples of impulsive response tools. So those are the things like avoiding conflict, isolating, shutting down, being the peacemaker, caretaker, rescuer, fixer. So all of those things we all used. Some of those, I used as a boy. And because we're trying to make our childhood family, we're trying to make that functional. We're trying to make it a safe place for us emotionally. And so that's where we learn as a child how to sort of control our environment. So we're saying, okay, mom and dad are upset. So this is my story. Mom and dad are upset. And I thought as a little boy, if I was perfect, then they wouldn't argue. So that was my interpretation. It's the expression, children are great observers and lousy interpreters. And so I was taking all of that in, and I'm like, oh, they're yelling because of me. If I'm perfect, if I try to do everything right, they won't yell. Well, of course that didn't work because they weren't yelling about me. I'm sure I wasn't an angel, but they were going through their own process. But that's what stuck with me. And so that then began this false narrative within me that I had to then overcompensate. I had to be better than just being myself.
This is so true. We are meaning makers. We're human,
Mm-hmm.
especially when we're children. So
Yep.
you just really put a highlighter on there's what is and what we make it mean. And
Mm-hmm.
as parents, I mean, I think all of us want to just bubble wrap our children so
Right.
there no harm comes to them. And not all of us taking the summit are parents. We are
Right.
all parenting that little one inside ourselves. If we can understand there's what is and what we made it mean, then we can start getting curious about what we made it mean. Like you just shared as a little boy, you
Mm-hmm.
were of the idea that if you were good, the
Yep.
chaos would stop.
Right.
And what age were you when you unearthed that nugget, that awareness of yourself?
I was about 8 years old. So this was after my younger sister was born, and there was at the time in our household there was a lot of family dysfunction and drama. And I coined the term age of wounding. And so my age of wounding, which really sort of encapsulates all of these sorts of behaviors that I was doing and what was happening in the household, is around the age of 10.
Mhm.
So, and I do talk about a specific example that happened that sort of kind of blew that up for me. But that's my age of wounding is 10 years old. So what happens is our inner child, our wounded inner child, when triggered in our adult life, steps in front of us because the wounded inner child is all about protection. And so that's where the wounded inner child is like, okay, what do I need to do? So we use those same tools that we had in childhood in our adult life. And that's where we're trying to make peace with someone. We're like, oh, I need to shut down, or I need to get really big. Whatever the tools were from childhood, that's what we're going to use as an adult. That's what the wounded inner child is using. And then later, people will say, I responded, I started yelling, I had a temper tantrum. And later I sat back, I'm like, why did I respond that way? Well, it's because the wounded part of them was responding that way. So again, the good news is that that can be healed. But just as I'm saying this, maybe some of your viewers are starting to connect with some examples they have in their own life.
Mhm.
And that's the biggest part of healing, is that awareness. Because when we're aware of things, then we can heal them. If we name it, we can claim it. So it's about understanding how that started and how that's showing up, how that's demonstrating in our life today. So a lot of parents and caregivers, adults will say to me, when they start to learn about all of this, they're like, gosh, I think I've already screwed up my kids. So they get really nervous because they're learning more about their own behaviors and they're seeing what they might be putting onto their own kids. But what I say is that, healing can start right now. Your awareness of, what you're carrying forward, you can begin to heal that and work with your children in a better way.
Absolutely. That awareness is always to be celebrated. Everyone out
Mhm.
there, this summit is going to turn so many lights on, and all of us are going to celebrate in that moment where we want to say, why is it so messy in here? All the lights went on and I'm seeing lots of piles
Right,
of things that I would like to move.
right,
But I would, and I know Robert, with your work, you would invite everyone into celebrating that awareness as in and of itself, because that's
right,
where all of that healing comes from. And you talk about, it's really non-judgment, and you're talking about repair, and repair is everything. And that's not possible when we have our eyes closed and our hands over our face, like it's not happening.
mhm,
So speaking to that repair, you in your work really go deep into this idea of boundaries. And
mhm,
I wonder if you could speak to the intersection between our core wounds,
mhm.
the kind of common experience of the inner child, and the way that it manifests as impulsivity. You spoke about a number of ways we could see that core wound, and that
Mhm.
intersection between those core wounds and boundaries.
That's a great question. I'm going to give you an example first and then talk a little bit about boundaries. So the example that I use is very simple that most adults can relate to. And that's where a kid might come to us, your child might come to you and say, I have a tummy ache. And we might be busy doing stuff and we don't think they have a tummy ache. So what we say is, you're fine. Just go out and play. All right. And the kid's like, I thought I had a tummy ache, but I'm being told to just go outside and play. And so the kid then leaves. But what's happened in that moment is the parent has invalidated the child's own boundary system. So the child has said, I'm hurting. The parent says, no, you're fine. The child then is like, well, I guess I can't trust myself. That's where a lot of people begin to doubt themselves. And they also begin to give power to other people where someone else knows me better than I know myself. So that in that little example, I've blown it up to really expand our awareness today as adults as far as how deep those wounds can go in a very subtle exchange. And so what I say is now multiply that over, from birth to 20, and how many times that invalidation or those sorts of invalidations would happen with a child. So then that's when I see the adult come to me and they're like, yeah, I can't trust myself, or I'm always second guessing myself, or I'm always looking for reassurance. And I'm like, where did this come from? Right? Well, a lot of times it's from these sorts of stories. So the path to our healing is through effective functional boundary setting. So all of these different behaviors and sort of acting out things that I'm talking about, all of them can be healed with boundaries, internal boundaries and external boundaries. So internal boundaries are promises and commitments we make to ourselves, like I'm not going to eat pizza every day, which I
I
would love to
cannot
do.
make that. No, I'm teasing.
Right. So that is it's a promise I'm making to myself. I'm going to be good to myself. This is how I'm taking care of myself. An external boundary is saying, Suzanne, you're a lot of fun, but I'm not going to go skydiving with you. So, it's like I'm putting that out there. So it's where I'm forming a boundary, stating a boundary with someone else. So that's an external boundary. So if the viewers can just think of that and begin to say, okay, what are my internal boundaries? How do I keep myself safe? What are my own sort of guidelines? And how do I do that with other people? Because boundaries really create a sense of emotional safety in our relationships. So the idea that as a kid, I didn't learn good boundary setting because I was very attuned to my mom and dad. I could tell you exactly like their mood on any day. I knew how to read their expressions. I knew their vocal tone. I knew how they were walking. I had a whole matrix as a kid, like, okay, this is how I need to be because this is how they are today. So I didn't have really a strong boundary system. So that's one of the things in my therapy that began in my 20s that I had to start to learn. So it's something where we have to be very consistent with that.
Yes, we do. We get to, don't we? We get to tune in, notice,
Yep.
and then trust. I mean, you could almost tease that. Okay, we talk about having boundaries. That only happens after we've had some awareness that there's some information inside ourselves that isn't congruent with the moment. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, Robert, we are going skydiving. And I start to bully you with my fun
Right,
adventure self.
right.
You're going, yeah, that sounds really fun. Actually, no, like my entire body is in fear right now. You don't make me jump.
But if I didn't have a strong intact system, and I'm like, oh, Suzanne's going to really be upset with me, I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go. And
Yeah.
the minute I say, okay, I'll go skydiving with you, I'm starting a regret cycle inside of me. And the minute I said, yes, I'll go, that's a disconnect from my authentic self.
Yes.
So every time we essentially say yes, but we mean no, in those sorts of examples, we're breaking our connection with our authentic self. And that really is what erodes away at our sense of wholeness and completeness. So that's why boundaries are so essential. I talk about, in my book, I talk about it. Chapters 4 and 6 are all about boundaries because it's huge. It's what holds us together. It's what has helped me heal the most out of my whole, training and my own personal journey are boundaries. So I encourage people to think about where they may not be setting a strong boundary and ask themselves, just to, again, observe, like, okay, why can't I set a strong boundary with this person or in this situation? And just sit back and say, well, I don't want them to be disappointed, or I don't want to sound mean. A lot of people will say that. I certainly said that when I started out. Like, I want to be liked. So they will just observe that and then see if you can find a way to say a small no to someone, like, well, no, I don't want to go get Mexican food tonight for dinner. And then see how that friend responds. People who respect our boundaries would be like, oh, okay, well, where would you want to go for dinner? Right. And then there's a reciprocal exchange with that person. Or if someone says, what do you mean you don't want to go to Mexico, have Mexican food tonight? We got to go. We have to go. So someone's bullying me into that. And if I don't have a strong, intact boundary system, I'm like, okay, I'll go. So it's like, that's how quickly it happens. But people who respect us will respect our no's. They'll respect our boundaries.
And it's a gift you give yourself. It's also a gift you give the other person, is what I've noticed. Because when you're with someone, if you are a strong, assertive personality and you're with someone who doesn't really have a clear bearing and
Yep.
they're giving you a yes when you push back and you're like, I had Chinese yesterday. What about Mexican? And they're like, okay, there's a loss for the person receiving the yes, truly, because now I'm not hanging out with you or your authentic self. And you said it's the beginning of breeding resentment, right?
Yep.
And so those, if you look at those as like little rocks you're putting in your backpack, that gets really heavy after a little while of, and then
Yep.
do you ever have the experience where then you blow? Like you're just accommodating, and then
Right.
it's that 0 to 100.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so to your example, so what happens is a lot of times people will say, I just can't deal with this anymore. And what that means is they haven't set boundaries. They've just like said, yes, yes, yes. They've avoided all this conflict, but then they're just like headed up to here. So what I say is we pay for our boundary setting either on the front end or the back end. On the front end of the exchange, we're saying, no, I don't want to go. If we don't say that no on the front end and we agree to go skydiving, then what I'm paying for on the back end is resentment, regret, kicking myself, knowing I should have said, no, I don't want to go. So either way, we pay for it.
It's exhausting. Right? Is that a litmus test to like, I am not setting boundaries good in my life? Is there a correlation between exhaustion at the end of the day or even drama?
Drama.
Could you speak to that? How that experience in our own selves, where we get to the end of the day and we look back at the day and there's either that exhaustion or drama, how does that tie in to either having set boundaries or maybe not?
Well, I think the exhaustion comes in, like in my example, growing up, I was so plugged in to how my mom and dad were that I was exhausted, as a kid, but I didn't know why. I would go down to in the woods and by the creek by our house, and that was my escape. That was like my only time to like get some respite. And I just realized this last year how I would walk back home and I could feel this like heavy cloak coming on me because I knew I was sort of going back to work, right? So I was going back to my job as the peacemaker and having to do all this work. I think that plays out in relationships all the time where people are kind of managing other people. And like, okay, if I say this to her, she's going to get upset. If I do this with him, he won't like it. And so there's all of this stuff going on. And the reality is if we set boundaries, if we have clarity about that, then we are having what I call a cleaner exchange, meaning, no, I don't want to do that. The other person might not like it, but in my earlier example, people who respect us, respect our boundaries. And if someone doesn't like what we're saying, then that says a lot about that person and about our relationship. So it's like you said, it's a litmus test. It's a way to really kind of understand the functionality of our relationships.
I love it. I love it. And I know that we as parents and some of us as non-parents, but parenting that little inner self can resonate with that feeling tired because we want to control both ends of the narrative, not only our own experience, but how we're being perceived or received or reacted to, or the
Yep.
rightness or the wrongness of someone else's feelings. For me
Mhm.
personally, letting go of that other side
Yep.
of controlling that narrative was a
Yep.
regain of of endless energy because all of
It's,
a sudden my job description, as you called it, changed.
yep.
And
It's
you were a sensitive
emotional.
boy, right? A sensitive boy.
Very, yes. So, when I learned boundaries and started to set them consistently, I felt a sense of emotional freedom. And that's really what's waiting for all of us when we began to do this. But I will tell you that when I started to set boundaries consistently with friends I had in my life at the time in my 20s, they didn't like it because they wanted me to show up and be the gift giver, the caretaker, the peacemaker. And I was like, I'm not doing that anymore because that's exhausting for me. And they're like, well, you're not so much fun anymore. And what happened was because I wasn't reaching out and feeding that relationship, there was no reciprocation. They weren't calling me. And so it really was a painful experience, but very revealing. It taught me a lot about myself and my relationships.
And did you source new relationships that began with you putting out maybe a different message that then attracted somebody different into your life? When you closed those chapters, what happened?
Well, there certainly was a period of kind of the desert where I didn't have all these connections, but I was sort of fooling myself because I had all these narcissistic or manipulative people that I thought were fun and great, but I was just projecting onto them who I needed them to be versus who they really were. And so as I healed and I started to open up my own awareness, I was like, oh, that's what this relationship was about. And so when I began to recruit new people into my life, I had to really understand myself and really understand the red flags that maybe before I wasn't seeing. So when we're wounded, we don't see someone else's wounding. We're just like, okay, they do drugs every day. Okay. You know, like we just don't, it doesn't register. But when we're healed, then we're like, oh, that's like not good how the choices they're making. So a healed lens can see others wounding much more clearly. And this is something I talk about in my relationship book of people understanding their own wounds that they're still working on, as well as being able to recognize a red flag. So a red flag could just easily be how someone responds to you, or if they do something that's not nice and disrespectful. Pay attention to that gut reaction, because that's your boundary system in action. So our boundaries really are our gut reaction to a situation. So if someone doesn't treat me very well, I'm like, that really stands out. That wasn't so great. And that's a red flag.
I have noticed you're talking about like picking up a weight and strengthening a new muscle.
Mhm,
And when you strengthen a new muscle, my background as a physical therapist, it gets sore a little bit and then it grows through the
mhm,
actual tearing of flesh is actually how we grow. So what you're describing sounds a little bit painful and it sounds like we grow through it. And then
mhm,
there's a result
mhm,
that is
mhm.
healthier relationships, perhaps, or as you said, maybe
Yep.
tuned in to ourselves at a new level where we can respect the red flags. Do you see people over course correcting where they begin to do boundary work and it's like they have this new muscle and it's a new thing and they get super defensive or super reactive out of that, almost like a pendulum swings. It's like, I'm over here for anything. And then, no, you're not going to make me do that. And either side
Right.
of that pendulum, it feels like a victim is in the
Mhm.
is in the seat driving. Does that resonate?
That's great. And I like your pendulum analogy. And I also use the analogy of a throttle on a boat, where as we're learning to set boundaries, we might put that throttle all the way down and we're saying no to everybody and and but then we're easing back and we're like, okay, it's just like a new tool we're using and a new muscle we're exercising, and we're not sure how far to push down, how far to lean back. We're not understanding where neutral is yet. So it's just a skill that takes a little time to learn, but really pay attention to, like I said, putting out some small no's and see how people respond,
I
and
love
see
that.
your own response, see what's going on inside of you when you state those boundaries. And you're like, oh, she's mad at me now. I said that. And it's like, all right, make sure you're not making up a story. You don't know for sure if she's mad or you're at you or not, because of a boundary, and just see how their relationship flows.
Love that. I love this opportunity. It's so tangible. So everybody today, a little bit of a no, which takes tuning in and listening for that resistance, just any
Mhm.
resistance, and
Yeah.
then being okay to put words to it and then see how that goes with the people around you. And how are you able to stand in that truth, in your truth? Are you able to, or do you backpedal and apologize? And I loved what you said in your book about the tendency to over apologize. So you talk about, impulses and how we can discover our core wounds. And you give this exhaustively long list of
It
opportunities for
is.
us to see ourselves operating out of our wounded inner child. I'm like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And one of
I
them,
know.
right? I know. And one of them I just love because it never really sat well with me, the over apologizing, like, especially if my kids are doing it, I always feel like, oh, no, 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 you don't have to say sorry. And, I'm like, oh, what am I doing such that you're wanting to apologize to me for not wanting to unload the dishes and using your words to say, I really don't want to do that. I'm sorry. It's like, well, no, remove the I'm sorry. You just
Mhm.
don't want to do that thing, period. Right? So can you speak to that? Because I think apologetic is like a fabulous thing in our society to be apologetic to be
Mhm.
sorry, to be humble and sorry. Honestly, it's like we make kids say sorry. We cultivate. We're in a society that holds that up as like a fabulous thing. So can you speak to maybe
Right.
the pain behind that? I'm sorry.
I love that. And I love being able to make that distinction because I think it shows up a lot, like what you're saying. So if you think about it, there are two types of responses, a healed response and a wounded response. So a healed response of apology would be, I really am sorry I did that. That's totally my fault and I apologize. So we're talking about a behavior that I did, that I offended someone in some way. So I'm apologizing for that. I'm open, vulnerable, heart exposed, heart-centered apology versus a wounded responsive apology where someone is apologizing for who they are. So they're coming in and saying, oh gosh, I really am sorry I did that. I didn't mean to do that. So what they're doing is they're scrambling, their ego is scrambling at that moment to try to regain some ground that they think that they lost in their relationship with that other person. They're scrambling to regain some real estate as far as like, okay, I'm sorry, I hope you still like me. Are we still friends? And so that's the frantic kind of wounded responsive apology where we're apologizing for ourselves. We're not just
Mhm.
apologizing for a behavior, we're apologizing for who I am. And the core of that is shame. So shame is I am a mistake. Guilt is I made a mistake. So that sort of wounded apology is all about, oh my gosh, I am so bad. How can you ever, can you forgive me? So that's, I really feel so much for people who are walking around with that core wounding of not good enough because they're the ones that are apologizing a lot.
That is my core wound. I'm enough is the mantra I say when I feel myself. I call it vibrating, where I feel a vibration in my body where I start to either get frantic or anxious or sad or nervous or reactive or judgmental. And I just breathe in, I love myself, and I breathe out, I am enough.
That's
And
beautiful.
yeah, and it's that core wound of shame, of I am not enough. And I really believe there's a sort of almost universality to some lower vibration message as human beings that we move through. It's not broken to be human and to struggle or to hurt. And your books help us have awareness and acceptance. And I do
Mhm.
think we think as parents or people that we're going to do it right, where it's going to stop, and then the
Mhm.
human experience won't happen to the next generation.
Mhm.
And that is just setting us up to fail because we're going to have some thoughts and messages.
Right.
And you talk about projecting our core wounds. And I thought we could maybe end with a little bit of awareness around, how do we know what are some of the most common ways we might be unconsciously projecting our core wounds onto others? Can you help us there, either as partners, co-workers, or maybe even parents?
That's a great question, and it happens all the time where we are all projectors, whether we like it or not. So what projection means, think of like a movie projector in the center of your chest going out, and we're projecting how we feel about ourselves onto someone else, and the stories we tell ourselves onto someone else. So if I'm critical and judgmental, my projection onto someone else is, oh, I can't believe he just did that. Look how he screwed up. He should have done this. So I'm projecting this shame onto someone else, but that's my own stuff. And so it happens over the course of days of the day. And it's so easy to happen. I had a dad the other day recognizing how he's projecting shame onto his kids with just what he's saying. Like, oh, I can't believe you did that, sort of thing. And so in session, we just hold that and we recognize, okay, how he was told that at one point, and now he's projecting that onto his kids. And so there's an opportunity for healing within this. So pay attention to the words you're using, how you're describing, explaining things to your children or to your friends, and see what you might be projecting onto them, even though you don't mean to. Just check in with yourself. And again, like what you were saying before, just a gentle course correction, bringing in a new tool, talking about how we can look at the person more wholly and completely, rather than just looking at these wounds. We're all an amalgamation of our healed and wounded parts. It's all beautiful. All of you is welcome here. And it's about us being gentle with ourselves on this path.
What a beautiful message to end with, because it's so true and full of hope, I believe, and it lifts us up, because so much of our journey work and our healing work can make us feel heavy or pull us down. And I would love to end with you sharing how people can learn more about your work. I am in love with your first book that I'm diving in deeply with now, and I hear rumor there might be more on the horizon. So share with our listeners how we can interact with your work, and maybe just one final thought you might have for listeners today on this journey we're all on.
I will. Well, thank you for allowing me to talk about my books. They're my book babies. So Healing Your Lost Inner Child with the companion workbook, and then Healing Your Wounded Relationship. And my books have sold over 38,000 copies worldwide and will be translated into 8 languages. And I'm just so proud of this because it represents my own healing, but the healing I've done with others, and also the healing opportunity that you can have going through and doing this work. And it's about, everybody can reach me through my website, theartofpracticalwisdom.com. And you can also follow me on YouTube, The Art of Practical Wisdom. I'm trying to put up more videos just explaining more of these concepts, because I truly want everybody to have this information, because healing is available to all of us. And that's the message, that it's about kind of getting out of our own way and stepping into this more healed space, and really creating a safe container for all of us to welcome our authentic selves back into us, so we have that emotional freedom today.
Healing is available to all of us. Robert, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Suzanne. I loved it.